Okay, why don't we go ahead and get started? Next slide, please. Welcome, everyone. I'm Heather Gotham, Director of the Mental Health Technology Transfer Center Network Coordinating Office. We are very excited to have today two speakers from the National Child Traumatic Stress Network to provide the third session in our series on preventing and responding to family violence during COVID-19. And they'll be specifically talking about minimizing risk for conflict and coercion in families with school-aged children. Next slide. A few housekeeping items. We have done everything we can to make today's presentation secure. If something unexpected happens and we need to end the presentation, we will follow up with you using your registration information. We'll all cross our fingers that that does not happen. All attendees are muted and cannot share video. Again, if you have a question for the presenters, please use the Q&A pod, but if you have a comment or link for attendees, please use the chat. We are recording the session and the slide deck will be posted on our website within a few days. You'll receive an email following the presentation and it'll be, give us a couple days to access a certificate of attendance. We can only provide certificates to folks who've been on the call or the session for at least 30 minutes. We'd love for you to follow us on social media at Twitter and Facebook at MHTTC Network. Next slide. Just a bit about us. The Mental Health Technology Transfer Center Network, MHTTC Network, is funded by SAMHSA. We are a national network of 10 regional centers, a National American Indian and Alaska Native Center, a National Hispanic and Latino Center, and a network coordinating office. Technology transfer, don't be fooled. It's really about accelerating the adoption and implementation of mental health related evidence-based practices. So our technologies that we're disseminating and implementing are evidence-based practices for the mental health field. Next slide. All of our services are also provided for free. I would recommend, if you haven't been in contact with your regional center yet, that you go over to our website, mhttcnetwork.org, and find your regional center. Our regional centers cover all of the US states and territories. And there we'll have the best information on local and regional services, training, resources, technical assistance. Next slide. So today's session is on preventing and responding to family violence during COVID-19. It's part of a 4-series session. The next session will be on August 11th. We're excited to have partners with the National Child Traumatic Stress Network. Next slide. Just to say that this presentation was prepared for the network. Sorry about that. The presentation was prepared for the network under a cooperative agreement from SAMHSA. And just to make sure everyone knows, all of the content of today's presentation is provided by our speakers and does not necessarily reflect the opinions of SAMHSA. We'll have an evaluation at the end, and we would really appreciate everyone receiving today's session to participate in the training. It's very brief, just a few questions, but really helps us to get feedback on our services and make our services better in the future. Next slide. Our presenters, I'm very excited to introduce David Kolko, who is Professor of Psychiatry, Psychology, Pediatrics, and Clinical and Translational Science at the University of Pittsburgh School of Medicine. And he directs the Special Services Unit at UPMC Western Psychiatric Hospital. Really devoted to promoting implementation of evidence-based practices for children and adolescents who are victims and or perpetrators of physical sexual aggression. He is the co-developer of Alternatives for Families, a CBT-based intervention to improve family relationships. We're very excited to have David Kolko with us today. Our second presenter is Ashley Fiore. I'm sorry, Ashley, Fiore or Fiore?
Fiore.
Fiore, my apologies. Ashley Fiore, who is a licensed clinical social worker with 25 years of experience treating childhood trauma in children's advocacy centers and domestic violence sexual assault agencies. She provides evidence-based mental health trauma treatment to children and their families and disseminates evidence-based treatment practices. She's endorsed as a master trainer by the developers of trauma-focused CBT and serves as clinical faculty for the North Carolina Child Treatment Program at Duke University's Center for Child and Family Health. Next slide. Again, very excited. Two excellent clinicians who have a lot of experience. They're going to provide a lot of great information on the ground on how to deal with cases of family violence. And I will turn things over to David to get started. Thank you. Oh, David, we have you muted.
Is that better?
There we go. Thank you.
I didn't realize I was unmuted. I was muted. Well, anyway, thank you so much, Heather, for your very kind remarks. And let me just also thank SAMHSA for sponsoring this series and for inviting me to participate in it. And I'm also very grateful that I get to participate with my friend and colleague, Ashley Fiore. And what we've tried to do based on this particular title is to talk a little bit about how we, on a regular basis, try to monitor and manage risk for family conflict and coercion in a broad range of families. It's true that this is under the umbrella of violence and violence prevention during the COVID era, but of course, much of what we'll talk about, much of what we do, and much of what you do routinely with lots of families, not just now during COVID, but outside of the COVID era. And so I hope a lot of what we'll talk about is relevant to any particular family at risk for family violence. And so what we will do today is I'll give a very brief overview of the field, including child physical abuse information. And then Ashley will present and discuss her really interesting and challenging case that is actually ongoing, so it's very fresh. And then I will provide a very brief summary and some comments based on, the field as well as intervention issues. And then the two of us, as Heather mentioned, will both participate in a Q&A, and we will do our best to respond to your questions. So let me go to the next slide, please, and highlight something that may occur in any city, in any country, which is that we have cases that unfortunately, when they get to the media, are very serious cases that involve, in many cases, death. And so this is a case from 1 month ago today in the Pittsburgh region, actually not far from where I live. And it tells the story, sadly, of a 3-year-old named Bella who experienced a lot of forms of abuse, especially physical abuse. And I think one of the reasons this is important for us to recognize is that this may be, yes, one of the more serious consequences of physical abuse. And this is clearly a tragic reminder of the nature and the impact of physical abuse. And so it highlights there are times when hope and help are just not available. Obviously there's a complicated case, multiple forms of abuse, and it's important to realize that we discuss cases where life and death are very much in play. But the other thing I just wanted to highlight is it also reminds us that there are many, many cases that don't make it into the newspapers, fortunately. There are cases you see, there are cases we see, where we are trying very hard to prevent these kinds of outcomes. And as a result, it's another reminder of how vital it is, how critical it is that we do this kind of work with these families to obviously avoid these types of outcomes. So let's go to the next slide and just say a little bit about what we've learned in our literature. I apologize that this is such a brief summary, and I just wanted to highlight a couple of things for you. One is the definition that our government uses, and as you can see, it involves someone in a caregiving role who either acts or fails to act in a way, and it could either lead to serious physical harm or present imminent risk of harm. And I think this is an important description to mention because it highlights both what one does and perhaps possibly what one doesn't do that might lead to this. But it's also important to highlight it's not that clear to figure this out, right? We all understand there's no single act, right, that defines something as abuse, physical abuse. There's no form. And secondly, there's no real severity criterion. And so there's a lot of variability in the types of behaviors that might fall under physical abuse. And of course, for today, we're broadening it to include conflict and coercion. In terms of prevalence, you can see within child welfare populations, about 11% of those who have a history of maltreatment were actually harmed in 2018, fairly recently. And that number goes up if you include those who are not just harmed, but also endangered. If you look at surveys of children and youth, you see that about 4% of that population reports being physically abused in the past year, and about almost 10% in their lifetime, so about 1 out of 10. I added something from the Ontario parent study. I heard Andrea Gonzalez about a month ago present very, very recent findings, all taken from the COVID era. And I just wanted to highlight a couple of the rates of the behaviors that parents, caregivers reported. And as you can see, the rates are quite high. 40% had partner conflict, 40% acknowledged that they exploded towards their children, or 30% reported that they picked on their children. Fortunately, the rate of smacking their child was far lower, but it's not non-existent, and it's still a worry at 2.7%. And then from the literature, I just highlighted a couple of the typical consequences we might appreciate in families where there has been a child who has been physically abused or exposed to conflict and coercion. And you can see the range, greater stress responses in terms of physical findings. We have neurological findings showing changes in the brain as well as brain functioning like executive function, aggression in terms of behavior, in terms of emotional problems. We have depression. All of you know full well the range, but I think it's important to understand this is also coming from research literature that has documented a broad range of a fair number of very serious problems, including risky behavior such as sexual substance abuse. But I also want to mention that we also have to be worried about long-term consequences such as criminality. So now let's turn to the next slide and address some of the intervention and service considerations very briefly. One, we understand the importance of having evidence-based treatment, and I've listed here the 4 of them that are family-focused interventions. You can find more information about them on the NCTSN website. We all appreciate the importance of understanding someone's traumatic response and their own unique traumatic reactions. But of course, knowing that helps us then mitigate some of the risk factors and build on protective factors. And the comment below simply highlights the fact that we all want to see all these elements delivered. We also recognize that some of our systems may not respond fairly to everybody, and that certainly an appreciation of the history of being disenfranchised or mistreated must be taken into consideration in any available treatment. So let me turn to now a couple of core concepts, and I want to just highlight a few for understanding traumatic stress responses. In terms of number 2, for example, we know that children exhibit a wide range of reactions to force and to physical abuse and to any form of abuse. In fact, in some cases, we see almost no response or very limited response that we can at least detect. And in other cases, we see many. And I think this is really important for us to keep in mind. Second, it's important to understand, for example, in number 3, that many of these children are engaged in dangerous, hostile, unsafe environments on a regular basis, not even just during COVID. So it's really important to understand that that may be something in their life that is ongoing. And then finally, I just want to highlight number 6, though they're all important, which is that working with physically coercive families does evoke distress in providers and that may limit their ability to be empathic. We'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. And then I just want to show you one more slide, which has some risk factors and protective factors. I know all of you may have seen information like this. This was our attempt to summarize those factors for you across 3 critical domains: individual factors, family factors, and community factors. And of course, some of the factors in the family, like the burden of extra caregiving or the worry about testing positive for COVID, of course, are a little bit more unique to today's circumstances, but many of these are just generalizable to most cases. So I hope that provides a bit of a context for Ashley's interesting case, and I'm going to turn it over to her now. Thank you.
Thank you, David. So I'm excited to be with you all today and to share with you a family that I was privileged to work with. I'm going to give you some highlights of AFCBT using this case as an application, and I'm hoping that you'll also leave with some practical strategies that you can use with families that you're working with as well. This is a family where there's a dad who's 36 and a UPS driver. He's married to stepmom, and they have a 5-year-old son and also a newborn who was born during the beginnings of AFCBT. Jack is the child that I worked with. He's 11 and he lives with his mom. He's currently having supervised visits with his dad and has been diagnosed with ADHD and PTSD. Jack's mom is 41. She also lives with her mother, who has some permanent disability that puts her at increased risk for COVID. And mom has been working intermittently because of the pandemic as a waitress. And she's also had a fair amount of concerns for her mother's health and well-being as well. DSS became involved with the family, which in our community, that's Child Protective Services, because dad left marks on Jack in January. And dad was actually charged with child physical abuse, since this had been the second incident that had come to the authorities' attention. The family had, well, Jack and his father had actually been referred a year prior to receive AFCBT, but they didn't follow through. At the time, dad said his work schedule was so unpredictable. He didn't know when he would finish his deliveries, so he couldn't predict when he would be able to come for sessions, and they never followed through. And so we actually began AFCBT exclusively via telehealth because of the pandemic. And I'm still working with this family now. Next slide, please. I administered several standardized assessment measures. I'd like to draw your attention to the Alabama Parenting Questionnaire and to the UCLA PTSD Reaction Index scores, though. You'll notice that you know, mostly this is a family who looks good on paper, and I think dad knew what the right answers were, but was having trouble putting that into practice. So he described himself as being very warm and positive and involved. He did acknowledge that he sometimes yells. He did acknowledge that he sometimes would hit Jack with a belt. And he was reflective that sometimes he did let Jack out of a punishment early, depending on his mood. He didn't do much ignoring and hadn't used that as a parenting skill. You'll notice on the UCLA that Jack reported fairly significant symptoms of post-traumatic stress in response to the physical abuse, and such that would be consistent with a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder. His mother was more aware, but not fully aware of how this was impacting Jack, and dad had very little insight into the symptoms that Jack was experiencing. Next slide. Thank you. So the model we used, as I said, was AFCBT, and I'm going to ask David to give a quick overview of the steps of AFCBT, since this is his model.
Thank you, of course. So I'll just briefly mention that AFCBT has 3 phases. The first phase is engagement and psychoeducation. The second phase is individual skill building. And the third phase is family applications. And what you see below are possibly the world's longest acronym, alternatives, broken out with the actual content or topics that you would receive if you participated in the first phase, which is, as you can see at the very bottom, the second phase, which is in the middle, and the third phase, which is at the top. So the first phase really will highlight, getting to know someone, building rapport, learning about their family, the positive and negative experiences they are exposed to. And then we do something very similar also with caregivers. In the second phase, there's mostly work done separately by either the child or the caregiver, but it could be in parallel. Both of them may learn emotion regulation. Both of them separately learn a little bit about cognitive restructuring or reviewing thoughts. We have parental involvement in a positive parenting section. Then the child participates in an assertiveness and social skill lesson. And then the parent participates in a set of skill experiences related to teaching how to manage problem behavior. For those who have some type of PTSD, they would receive Imaginal Exposure. And then the actual child and parent then come together for our third phase, and they'll review positive ways to communicate, enhancing safety, which involves clarification, and then solving family problems. And then finally, not on the slide, is a graduation. And so that in a nutshell is the kind of material that a case would be exposed to, and that Ashley also utilized, but also adapting it for the needs of her case.
Next slide, please. So just to give you an idea of the overview and structure of sessions, I met with this family twice per week. I had one session via telehealth with Jack and checked in with Mom. In retrospect, I wish that I had included her more directly. That's one of the challenges when you're doing family work, is where do you stop in terms of accumulating clients in the family, and you could fill an entire caseload with one family. But if I could do this over again, I would include Mom more than I had. And then I also had a separate session every week via telehealth with Dad. So that those were twice a week. We met via Zoom, and due to the pandemic, all of the measures were administered over online via Zoom. Sometimes I had to act as tech support, which can be a challenge for us as clinicians. And we also had to do some problem solving. Our agency lends out iPads to families that need them for access to services, recognizing that we may not get them all back. But we wanted to make sure it was an equity issue. We wanted to make sure that families could all receive services. I'll share some additional resources about implementing evidence-based models over telehealth after this. But certainly one thing that was a tension was you couldn't explain the rules of telehealth once. One and done is not going to work for that. So I had to continually revisit that issue with the family. Mom frequently would think, well, couldn't you just meet with Jack while I'm at work? And I had to explain that no, that really wouldn't be safe. I needed to be able to call her by phone if we lost contact. And so she was able to do that. But it was something that we did have to revisit a lot. As you know, monitoring is really important with this population. And that's something that the Department of Social Services did, as well as I. And the way that you do that in AFCBT is through a weekly safety check-in, which is a structured part of every session. It is not confession. That happens at a different time in a different place. And with the weekly safety check-in, it's more focused on identifying what are the things that we need to problem solve around, and how will we do that collaboratively. There were no reports during weekly safety check-in of significant conflict or aggression that were continuing to happen. CPS was also doing routine visits separately with Mom and Jack, and Dad separately. And I also had very close collaboration with CPS. One of the premises that I operated on was that we wanted to reward progress by loosening structure, but still continue monitoring what happened when we offered that reduced structure. Next slide, please. So at orientation, you won't be surprised to hear that Dad was initially very guarded, and his main reason for participating was he said he needed to jump through DSS's hoops. When I talked to him about what his primary values as a dad were, he said that being accountable for one's actions really mattered to him. He was very proud of providing for his family. And that is something that I look back to and showed respect for throughout treatment. It was really important to Dad that his children learned to admit their mistakes. And what was important to him was how they handled it when they were in trouble. Regarding stresses in his life, most of those had an external focus. They were things like school challenges for Jack, his system involvement, Jack's attention and focus. And so I want you to watch as you hear more about this case, about how Dad becomes more internally focused and self-reflective about his role in things as he builds trust. A major strength of AFCBT to me are the topics related to alliance building and engagement. And so the first step of that was doing a ProCon decisional balance, which is sort of like a ProCon list on steroids. And I did this with Dad about what were the reasons that he would like to participate in treatment. What were the advantages of being in treatment? What were the disadvantages? So during this time where he's trying to figure out, can I really trust this woman? Of course, he said, there's nothing that would be a disadvantage about participating in treatment. So it's really helpful in those situations for the therapist to say, you know, that really there's a risk that this could make things more difficult for you. And so our voicing that risk and that recognition, I believe, shows great respect for their work and their investment in treatment. Dad's goals for AFCBT came directly from that ProCon list. They were things like reduce stress from having less system involvement. He thought it might be useful to get a third-party perspective on his conflict with his son. And he also said there was a possibility that this could make him a better parent to all three of his children. When I asked Dad to tell me about the discipline practices in his own family of origin, he was still guarded, you won't be surprised to hear. And so what I did was I asked him to hone in on times when, as a kid, he had different intentions and he felt misunderstood by his parents. And so he told me a story about when he was in high school and he was taking a girlfriend to a prom that was across state lines. She lived in the adjacent state. He knew how important it was to his parents that he be home on time. If your curfew was midnight, 12:01 was not okay. And so he really planned extra time. He had a great time. He was feeling so grown up. And he was coming back from this date, had a great time, walked in the door at 12:05 instead of midnight. And his parents lowered the hammer on him. And they did it, and they withdrew a privilege of going to basketball camp that he was really excited about attending the following week. But when I asked him how that felt to him, he said, it really clipped my wings. And so that's why I have this slightly disturbing picture in here of the chicken having its wings clipped, because that was a really important shift for Dad in his perspective. Clipping his wings and having the child's perspective was something that really changed the way that he started thinking about his parenting. So at that point, our family plan started. And I could say, we're going to individualize this. We're creating the toolkit for what works for you. And so it's future focused. We're working on building skills and options for him rather than looking backward at what he had done before. So when he would share something that was insightful or something that really would work for him, I would say, oh, that's great. We have to write that down. And so at that point, he started taking ownership for his own family plan and taking notes in session about what were the things he wanted to hold on to. What's the gem that I'm going to take from today and I'm going to use for home practice? And that's how we get families to shift from knowledge to practice. Is first they have to have the insight and the motivation, and then they need to practice it so it becomes a habit. So for his homework that week, which we call home practice, he decided what he would do was notice one thing that could be a misbehavior or a challenge that he experienced with each of his children, and take the child's perspective about what they were feeling, what they were thinking, what their intentions were versus the adult one. And so he even started applying that to his 5-year-old on a long car trip, who was asking every 5 minutes about how much longer, and remembering what it was like when he was the one sitting in the car for a long trip. Next slide. This next session happened from Dad's truck. So you remember in the beginning, one of the barriers to treatment was that he couldn't predict when he would be available for sessions. So this is a situation where the pandemic actually helped us out, because what Dad could do is park his truck at the top of a hill on his lunch hour, where he could catch a breeze. He propped me up on the steering wheel through his iPhone, and we would just have our session there. And it worked beautifully. So during this session, we reviewed the referral incident, and the focus there was really differentiating his intent from the method. So some language you might use in that circumstance is to say, what you were trying to do was this, but instead you ended up doing this other thing. And Dad was able to acknowledge that there are times I need to slow myself down so I don't do things I later regret. So we used that analogy of speed bumps. And I said, what will be your speed bumps? So he added that to his plan. What he thought would help him slow him down was considering the child's perspective. And also asking himself, is there another way to reach this goal? Where he got that idea was, we talked about when you encounter traffic and you're making a delivery, how do you handle it? And so he said, I'd go a different way. And we talked about how with parenting, you can also choose to go in a different direction. And the take-home message here for Dad was that you have the power to make a different choice. Next slide. Thank you. So what this is what I call a feelings wheel. And this was done by Jack in session over Zoom. And I want to walk you through what this is, the goals of it, and then I'll tell you a little bit about how to do it. I use this to investigate the nature and the impact of his positive and negative experiences at home. So you'll see that this is very individualized, and it also has implications for how you might reprogram the home environment. What I did was I asked him to tell me about all the feelings that came up for him during the referral incident. So those are the things you see listed in blue to the left. That's all we started with. And then I said, okay, I want you to assign a color to represent each feeling. So that's why you have the marks beside them, the blue for sad, green for mad, etc. And then I drew a circle in the middle, and I said, so if this were a pizza, and instead of it being your favorite kind of pepperoni pizza or mushroom or whatever you like, this one is a feelings pizza. And I want you to show me how big of a slice would you give to each of the feelings that you listed to the left. And so he colored those in using his finger. That's why it looks kind of rough, is he was coloring on the iPad. And you'll notice that embarrassed, when he got to embarrassed, he realized, oh my gosh, that was even bigger than what I first drew. I'm going to have another embarrassed slice. So he drew that in. And then he presented me with the problem of, but I'm not done with all my feelings. They were even bigger than the pizza. So I said, let's put some crust on it. So he threw guilty on there, and scared, and depressed. And then at that point, so you can see this is a gradual process. I asked him to tell me about each one. Tell me, what were you thinking when you were worried? What about it? What was your biggest worry? What made you feel embarrassed? Tell me an example of a time that you were really embarrassed. And walked around, and then he shared more additional details about it. So you can see that he has relatively few positive experiences at his dad's house, and that was even when prompted for specifics. And he identified lots of negative experiences at Dad's house. The thing that he labeled as most frequent and most upsetting was his dad pointing out every detail I do wrong with sports and yelling at me for small things. And he had several positive experiences at Mom's house, but he did acknowledge that he got in trouble and there was conflict at both homes about him completing his schoolwork and also getting off his electronics when he was asked. So the important thing about emotion regulation is I first wanted to teach him to name his feelings, so that when you're having a really strong feeling, you can first name it and then decide, I have choices about how I want to deal with it. And what Jack liked the best and found the most useful as a coping skill was deep breathing. And that was something that he would practice in between sessions, including with his father. And his father even noticed when I taught the same strategies to Dad, Dad said, hey, Jack's been doing that too. I've seen him doing that. And Dad used that as a cue for himself, another speed bump, that he needed to pump his brakes. Next slide, please. So meanwhile, with Dad, we did the same thing, emotion regulation work. I had 2 failed attempts, essentially, at trying to do this over telehealth. So for those of you who've been practicing in that modality during this COVID time, you feel the pain. The first time, Dad was at the hospital where his wife unexpectedly gave birth to their baby. And he was comfortable meeting in the waiting room, but I was not because of privacy. And the second time, we had technology issues. So what I did was I made sure to send him all of the materials by email and reschedule within that same week. That's really, really important for engagement, because if we can just put things off for another week, what's the urgency? And they're continuing. So always rescheduling within the same week had a big impact. And this is a dad who really has not missed any sessions unless he was physically incapacitated. So the work with Dad here was helping him identify what were his own anger and anxiety cues and triggers. So he was pretty clear that he noticed when he was feeling anxious or angry, his face would flush, his breathing would get more shallow, but he was less aware that his mental cues were things like he couldn't really think as well. And so I was able to provide some psychoeducation about how that oxygen, when we're doing that shallow breathing, our oxygen's going from our brain to our muscles, and you're not able to think as clearly. And he was able to recognize, oh my gosh, I hadn't realized how one-track minded I could be. And that I really start having tunnel vision. So with the practice of deep breathing and progressive muscle relaxation in session, he was able to use that to make better decisions. During those first 2 attempts, just to let you all know, I also was giving him feedback of my communication with the Department of Social Services. I don't want to hide any of that communication. I wanted to be trustworthy. And so I shared with him, this is what, they've checked in on how you're doing. Here's what I've shared with them. So I'm always keeping very clear communication. Next slide. Okay, so at this point, we began cognitive restructuring. And the highlight of this topic was helping him learn how to generate alternative thoughts when his son was doing what he perceived as shutting down. And how we got there was we started looking at what are some of the patterns that children have in their own unhelpful thinking. And one of the common things that kids will do when they've experienced aggressive behavior is blame themselves and take responsibility for others. And so I shared with him some of Jack's self-blame, that he felt that he should have stopped his friends so that his father wouldn't get angry. And using the ABC pathway, which is essentially the cognitive triangle, and a situation occurs, you have a behavior in response, and that leads to consequences. So using that, Dad was able to see he could go in a pathway that led him to his child shutting down and being more fearful of him and avoiding him, or he could choose to think about it differently and get a different result. So whereas he used to think he doesn't care, he's being disrespectful, his new cognition was, my son is building a wall to keep himself emotionally safe from me. And then that led to the thought of, I'm risking our future relationship if I cannot stop myself in the moment. This is my cue. So he decided to use the shutting down as a sign that he needed to back up and realize that he was coming on too strong. So for Dad, he also recognized that traps for him were cognitions that only force or punishment would do. And he began to ask himself, is this the only way to manage behavior, or could I approach it differently? And then the other trap for him was having a hostile bias. And the replacement thought was, is there another interpretation of this behavior? Next slide. So I'm still doing weekly safety check-ins with everyone, as you know. And I had begun the assertiveness topic with Jack. And he told me during weekly safety check-in about a situation that occurred the previous weekend where he said his father made comments about him being wimpy when he hurt himself because the family dog was overly exuberant, ran up to him and knocked him over, and he skinned his knees. And so, we talked about the situation, looping back to, are there any alternative explanations for this? for the son, but also supporting his need to stand up for himself. And how do you do that in an appropriate way? So we used assertiveness skills and role played, I feel blank when you blank. And we role played it 6 ways to Sunday. And he agreed that he would practice sharing those feelings with his father and his mother. He didn't think he would have any opportunities to practice it with friends that week, but he promised me he would practice it with both of them. So when I checked in with mom and with dad separately, he didn't do it very well. The first time didn't really take. And what was happening is Jack was still using very indirect passive communication with both of his parents. Next slide. So we came at it a different way. The recognition was that Jack was going to need some more scaffolding to be able to assertively communicate, particularly with his father. So Dad and I were on the topic of noticing positive behavior and how he wanted to manage behavior. And so, you know, I talked to him, I shared with him the situation with Dad about the dog. And then we role played options for how he might want to handle this situation to reinforce more of the behavior he wants to see in his child, which was sharing his feelings with him. And then we also talked about what would it be like for you to be the one to raise the issue with your child? Does that make it easier or harder for the child than if he's the one who has to raise this topic with you? And then we reflected again on what Dad's intentions were, what he meant, and how he might do that differently, the modality he might use. So in our role play, Dad said, you know, I've been thinking about the situation with the dog. I was worried about the dog hurting you, and I was trying to teach you to stand up for the dog. And so I said to Dad, and you know, we'd time out in our role play, and I asked, how could you invite your child to come to you, you know, to share this? And what do you think he might feel if you were the one who raised the topic of his behavior and how it came across with him? And Dad reflected and said, you know, it's really a rarity for parents to be the ones to acknowledge their own mistakes. And I was able to say to him, this seems in line with your values, looping back to the values from the beginning of treatment, because we teach by showing, and accepting responsibility and showing your child how to handle it when he makes a mistake was something that was important to Dad. So I'm able to convey, this isn't my idea, this is yours. I'm trying to help you implement what you value. So the next week at weekly safety check-in, I asked how it went. And Dad said it went great. He looked down at his son's knee and saw it was still skint and said, you know, I got to thinking, I didn't mean there was anything wrong with you. It was just the dog I was worried about. What I was trying to get across was I wanted you to stand up to the dog. If I said it the wrong way, or if it came across in a wrong way, I apologize. So a decent apology. Now, it could be better, but decent, right? And the breakthrough here is that Jack was honest with his dad. And he said, well, I took it that way, but my leg is healing up. It's okay. So he admitted that his dad had hurt his feelings, but he accepted his apology. And then I asked Dad, what do you think your son learned from this interaction? And he said, you know, on a small scale, I'm not very good at admitting when I'm wrong because I'm not aware of how I come across. So from this, my son is learning that I can admit when I'm wrong. The second thing is he's also learning how to approach it when he's the one who's wrong. The third thing is he's seeing his dad reflect on his interactions between the two of them and that Dad is working on making things better. So Dad said, I used to think that I should have done something differently because of how it impacted me. Reflecting on the interaction is what's different. Now I'm thinking about how it impacts the people around me. And so Jack seemed much more able to come to Dad and tell him his opinions after this. And Dad continued scaffolding him and saying, hey, I really want to know what you think about this. And so they've continued to have more practice with that, and both have gotten better at it. At that point, DSS had decided to allow unsupervised day visits with Dad. And Jack was saying, I'm not comfortable with overnight yet. So we stuck with the day visit. Next slide, please. So we needed to do some more work on noticing positive behavior. And I really wanted Dad to understand that warmth and trust is the foundation to all effective parenting. And a way to build that is I asked Dad to tell me an example of a bad boss he had had. Most of us have had some of those, and so it's easy to articulate. And he described his bad boss as someone who micromanaged the extra seconds it took to make a delivery, used progressive discipline, shamed him, demeaned him, had a mean face, and was mocking. And of course, he wasn't very interested in pleasing that person. So I said, so in contrast, tell me what made a good boss that you had different. And he said the good boss had worked for 30 years in the same job, knew what the job was like. You know, he'd been on the road before. I've seen it, he said. He realized we were all adults and we wanted to do a good job. He approached you and talked to you as an equal and empathized, and would ask things when something happened, like, what went on with that? And he described a more curious approach rather than one that's making assumptions. And so the next step was to say, so Dad, tell me what this has to do with parenting. And he decided he could give his child more choice in the decisions he made and seek his input and be more of a resource to his child. So he continued that by deciding to contract with his child as a new parenting skill. Whereas in the past, his bad boss approach had been to have his child copy the dictionary as a consequence. Now he was thinking, what would I want if I were in this situation? And how could he write a contract where they would both feel like they came out getting a good deal? So for home practice, for that particular week, he tracked his specific praise each day using popcorn kernels that he would carry in one pocket. He had 10 kernels for his wife, 10 for his 5-year-old, and 10 for Jack. And what was interesting was to hear Dad say when we made that plan for his home practice that this is something I really need to work on, and recognizing and being more vulnerable about the areas where he needed to grow versus in the beginning when he presented himself as being excellent at everything. And he decided he was going to try an experiment and see if, and not tell his family what he was up to. So for every time he used a specific phrase, he would use a kernel, move a kernel from right pocket to left over the course of the day. And he said, they're going to wonder what happened to me. What happened was his 5-year-old started carrying popcorn in his pocket. And the 5-year-old, he noticed while they were on vacation, would saw somebody picking up trash and thanked the person for picking up the trash and said, you're doing a really good job. Thanks for making things nice. So he was able to see that this was definitely coming out in his children. Next slide. So this is a reminder to practice what we preach as therapists. So just like I was working with Dad on specific praise, we also have to give specific praise back to our families that we're working with. And so I emailed Dad his gems from that session because he couldn't take notes since he was on vacation. And so what I did was I summarized his really important insights. The idea being that his insights and motivation could be built first, and then he could put it into practice. So his tips for how to be the good boss as a parent were, instead of saying to your child when they don't do their homework, now you have a 0, he would suggest try saying, what happened? And sharing, taking a more problem-solving, respectful approach rather than shaming his child. His sister, who was a teacher, had told him years before, get smaller, sit down with your child when you talk to him. And he said he had really discounted that. But now he was realizing that that might reduce the shame or fear that your child feels and shows that you're genuinely listening to them. And then I loved his comment of have an actual conversation, not an interrogation, because that's what allows your child to use you as a resource and shows them that you realize they want to do a good job. And then the last point was one that I summarized for him, which was to remember you've been on that road of growing up too. You've seen it, so you can empathize, just like a good UPS boss had done with him. And he left that saying that he wanted to inspire his children instead of making them fear me as his purpose to his children. Next slide. So on the left, before we began Imaginal Exposure, you can see that Jack's, how he divided responsibility for the incident that led to the referral was he felt like things were even Steven. It was his responsibility just as much as it was Dad's. And so in Imaginal Exposure, I had him gradually tell me the story of the referral incident in detail and paired that with coping skills and frequent sub-checks in order to help him achieve anxiety habituation and to make new meaning. So when we went through this, I asked him to tell me your thoughts behind each of those halves for me and Dad. And then I said, so using Socratic questioning, I said, so what happens when you hit someone? And who do most people see as responsible when hitting happens? And can you think of any other ways that parents could respond when their kids make a mistake? And Jack looked at me through Zoom and said, can we draw that again? And the larger one that you see is his new pie. And you'll notice he didn't give all of the responsibility to Dad. It's less what he's giving himself. And I really like that because he's not telling me what I want to hear. He's showing me my thought process has shifted some. And I just could say to him then, tell me how your thinking has changed about this. So the black and red are the smaller thoughts that make up that new pie. And I'll highlight the red ones. He said, our relationship isn't as good as it used to be because of him hitting me and the words he has said. We're both working to make it better. I used to think he was always mad at me. Now I don't. And he was able to reflect and say, Dad was trying to teach me not to be so reckless, which is helpful. He can do that without hitting me. So that's, that division of responsibility. My hope is that Dad can help him reduce the wedge that he assigns to himself a little further during their clarification work that will be upcoming. Next slide. So we are now preparing for clarification. Jack has prepared a few questions that he has for his dad that are, why did you flip out like that? And are you mad that I told? Do you still like me? What's going to happen the next time you get mad at me? What will you do? So these are not easy questions, right? And Dad will be preparing a letter to share with his son in a clarification session. And when I asked Jack his thoughts about sharing these with his dad, he said, I really feel like I'm like at a 3 or a 4 on my thermometer of a scale of 1 to 10. So he wasn't particularly nervous about sharing that with his dad. And he was actually looking forward to it. Next slide. So there are many challenges to doing this work. I will say that I've found that telehealth just invites casualness into sessions, and you have to constantly revisit what the expectations and rules and boundaries are throughout treatment. The second thing is, I noticed a big thing for Jack was he felt really stuck in a loyalty bind between his parents because they had had conflict for so many years. And so I was careful to make sure that the skills that he was learning in session, he applied to both parents as well as his friends. So these are skills that I wanted him to have broader application to than just his relationship with his dad. The third thing that you all probably have noticed with your own families is that his schedule was way off because of quarantine. And so a 1 p.m. appointment might be right when he was waking up. So when that happened and I had a drowsy kid on my hands, I would reschedule the appointment. And then I did do some collaboration with Mom about how can we help him get on a more structured schedule with the notion that school is going to be starting very soon. The other challenge was just the anxiety that you feel as a therapist, working with families that have so much conflict and aggression. And what helped me throughout that a lot was doing that weekly safety check-in, and that happening at 2 different points within the week so that I could get the client's perspective and the dad's perspective. I structured it at the start of each session along with homework review. So it was expected by everybody, not a surprise. And it was reassuring to me as the therapist that there were no significant concerns noted, but it also wasn't overly sunshiny. So I was glad to hear examples of things where they had some challenges and how they dealt with it. The final point I borrowed from TFCBT, which is the idea of minimal mastery, because families really need to see themselves making progress. And I think that was something that really built their engagement. Next slide. So just some final comments. the strategies that I would prioritize in this work are, building trust by respecting families' personal values and recognizing that we're all doing the best we can. That their best intentions are things that you can align with, and then help them rethink the approach if that's the problem. Being very direct and open about how the communication that you would have with the system, and to remind myself that families don't have to admit the force and aggression to get better. I think that where we've come in towards this phase of treatment is Dad and I are both talking like we both know this happened, but he's not said directly to me, yes, I did it. I'm wondering what's going to happen when we get to clarification, how he'll handle that. But even then, he doesn't have to admit it to get better. The next two bullets I think are similar in that we're trying to help families realize that they have some choice. And we're not telling them what to do. We don't want to invite a struggle with them. So these are some words that I've found to be helpful to really put that responsibility back with them and let them know that they're the ones who have a choice. And when you think about how you want to handle a situation, first attend to yourself and how do you handle your own emotional dysregulation so you can access your thinking part of your brain, and then consider what's going to be my best response, not my first response. The final step was really, and this is structured within AFCBT so nicely, you learn the skills in session and apply it as home practice, and giving Dad control over what he felt would be most valuable for him to work on that week, I think was really an important step. So what I hope you've seen is the migration from knowledge to skill in this family, and just a reminder that what we tell them isn't what sticks. It's applying it in a new way so that they can truly create a new habit is what results in change over time. So I'll let David make some final comments.
Yeah, thank you, Ashley. I'm gonna jump in here. I'm sorry, David, to interrupt. Thank you so much both for the session. We have reached the end of our time for today. I know we have a few more great slides. I wanted to remind everyone that the slides, the recording of the presentation, and a frequently asked questions document that we're going to prepare after the session will be available on our website in the next few days. So thankful for the work that you did today, that you both have done in this area, in this field, really advancing our understanding and ability to help folks. Our final session in this series will be in 2 weeks on August 11th, and that session will be presented in Spanish. Also, as you're leaving the session today, please remember to complete our very brief evaluation survey. We are always interested in positive and negative feedback to help us make our work better and more applicable to what your needs are. Again, David and Ashley, thank you so much for today's presentation.
Thank you.
I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.